Well, good morning. This is Barry Odell with the Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page, and it's Wednesday morning, May 11th, 2021. Good to see folks joining on today. We've got Gail, Linda, Barry, and Glenda. Good to see all of you guys joining on, and we have more. We are in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 today, and we're ready to start in verse 14 for those of you who are following along. Glad to see everybody this morning. 1 Corinthians 10:14 is where we'll start here in just a second. Give it a few seconds to let more folks join on. We are cross-posted onto the Near Churches page as well. As always, if you have any questions or comments while I'm going through the text, please feel free to use the comment section, and I will acknowledge those comments or questions when I see them. And I've told you before, if you have questions, maybe you have a Bible question that has nothing to do with 1 Corinthians 10 or what we're studying, well, throw that in there too, and we'll see what happens. All right, so we finished, obviously, yesterday with verse 13, very common passage. Hey, Miss Connie and Lyle, good to see you guys. No temptation has taken you but such as is common to man. So what we go through, someone else has been through. We need to remember that, and we also need to remember the faithfulness of God and that there is always a provision. There's always a way to get out of temptation. And, of course, we always think, or at least I always think of Jesus and the example that he set with his temptations. If I know what God says, if I know his word and what he expects of me, there's always a way out. I don't have to sin. I don't have to violate his will. So that's the way of escape, and we can bear it. Good morning, Brian. Let's see here. Louise and Brian have joined on. Good to have all you guys. All right, so verse 14, therefore, my beloved. So this, obviously, now I'm looking at my Bible here, and there's a break between verse 13 and 14, and there is a new section heading at verse 14, which is flee from idolatry. But the fact of the matter is, Paul didn't write verse 13 and verse 14, so obviously this is connected to the thought that he's just been writing about. Remember what he's been discussing here, how the Christian conducts himself in the world. Verse 18, you've got to be aware of your conscience. Did I just say verse 18? Chapter 8. You have to be aware of your own conscience. And you don't have you can't do things just because you have the right to do them. You have to be mindful of yourself, your own conscience. You have to be mindful of others. You get into chapter 9, he illustrates that point with himself. He had every right as an apostle to, as it says there in that chapter, if you preach the gospel, you should live of the gospel, but he didn't take advantage of that right. He was mindful of the issues that might cause, let's say. And so he brought himself under control and was a servant to all people. Chapter 9, verses 19 through 27. And because if you don't do that, if you don't subject yourself and practice temperance, you can become a castaway. 1 Corinthians 9:27. He himself could become a castaway. And so in the first half of chapter 10, he says, okay, so I've used myself. Now look at Israel from old. They all had the same experience. They were all delivered from Egypt. They were all baptized unto Moses. They all partook of the same spiritual food and spiritual water. And that's talking about the supernatural supply throughout the wilderness of the necessities of their food and water. But with many of them, God was not well pleased. So they didn't discipline themselves. They didn't stay within the parameters of God's will, let's say it that way. So he warns them. Paul warns the Corinthians then, based on all of that. Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. You've got to watch how you conduct yourself in the world. You're all going to go through temptations. You're not unique. You're not special. There's always a way to get out of it. But you have to flee temptation, or rather, you have to flee idolatry. So obviously, this thought of fleeing idolatry is connected to what he's been talking about. And I've heard it posed before, and I've said this before, and I think there's some truth to this. When you look at verse 13, when we begin to think that we're special and we're enduring things that nobody else has endured, we're essentially worshiping ourselves. We're practicing a form of idolatry. But as you read beyond verse 14, I think Paul's talking literally about idolatry. Okay, so that's where we are. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak to you, I speak as to wise men. Judge for yourselves what I say. So you're capable of, essentially what he's about to say here, you're capable of coming to the same conclusion that I've come to. The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? For we, though many, are one bread and one body, for we all partake of that one bread. So obviously, the warning of idolatry, flee from it. You know, he also said back in chapter 6, flee fornication. That was, there's no hidden meaning behind that. That's precisely what he meant, flee fornication. And I think the same thing is true here. Flee idolatry. As Christians, and what he uses here particularly is the cup and the bread. The what we refer to as the emblems partaken of in the Lord's Supper. When we commune, when we share in those things, we have joint participation. We are showing our unity with one another. We're showing our unity with Christ himself. And that's what one thing that is intended to do, to show our fellowship. And though there are many of us, many individuals that make up the one body, we are all in that singular fellowship as we partake of those things, as we partake of those emblems. Now, we know that when we get to chapter 11, beginning in verse 17, he's going to do some condemning because they've been abusing the Lord's Supper. They had changed they had changed everything about it, let's just say it that way. But in principle, when we partake of those items, we're showing our unification with one another, we're showing our communion, our fellowship with Christ himself. And then he pulls another example, observe Israel after the flesh. Are not those who eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? Well, yes, that question answers itself. What am I saying then? What's the point? That an idol is anything, or what is offered to idols is anything? Now, he addressed that back in chapter 8. We know, he says, we have knowledge that an idol is nothing in the world. Those are false gods. They're made up by men. But remember what he said, in everybody there is not that knowledge. Some Christians from that background still had a conscience towards those idols, and they couldn't partake in eating the meat that they might purchase, knowing that the rest of that animal or that meat had been offered to some false god somewhere. They had a conscience toward that. And Paul refers to them as the weaker brother. There's nothing wrong with that. So he kind of touches back on that subject here. We know, an idol's nothing. There's only one God. And that which is offered to idols, well, it's just food. Paul talks about that in 1 Timothy 4. All things are to be received with thanksgiving. They're sanctified by prayer. There were some things that were indicative of a falling away, and one of those things was forbidding to eat certain meats, certain foods. All of it's made for human consumption. That goes all the way back to the post-flood era, the Noahic covenant, as we call it. So anyway, those things are nothing. But there's a point he's making here. Remember, flee from idolatry. Rather, verse 20, that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. They're doing it with intent. You as a Christian could go into the meat market in the first century. You could buy meat that had been offered to an idol. You're not worshiping that idol. We've dealt with that in chapter 8. He's going to deal with it here again in chapter 10 here in just a minute. But the Gentiles do those things. The heathen, let's use that term. They do those things with intent. They are worshiping that idol. The child of God knows that's not really a god. But with the Gentile, as it says here, with the heathen, the pagan, let's use the word pagan maybe, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And then his warning here, which again is connected back to verse 14, I do not want you to have fellowship with demons. You partake of the Lord's Supper. That shows that you're in fellowship with the Lord and you're in fellowship with one another. Well, you better watch your associations in this world. I don't want you to have fellowship with demons. You cannot. Note, and that is what's the word? I'm thinking of what Jesus said back in Luke chapter 9. You cannot be my disciple. Well, it's definite. There is no possible way that both of these things can happen simultaneously. You cannot drink of the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the Lord's table and of the table of demons. Or do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than He? In other words, are we somehow capable of doing both of those things and at the same time pleasing God? Well, of course not. You're not stronger than God. You're not capable of doing that. So the warning of verse 14 is literally flee from idolatry. It's not just self-pity from verse 13 that I talked about. Well, nobody else is going through what I'm going through. There's some truth to that. But he's telling them, flee from idolatry, in view of the fact that you partake of the Lord's body and blood in the Lord's Supper. You partake of those emblems. That shows your union, your communion with Him and with one another. And that's what it's designed to do. You cannot do that and partake in pagan practices that are in your city. You got to remember, the Corinthians came from that background, all right? They didn't come from a Christian home. You go back to 1 Corinthians 6 and read verses 9 through 11. In fact, one of the things that's mentioned there, do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither fornicators nor idolaters. That's specifically mentioned. An idolater will not inherit the kingdom of God, and that's his point here. You have to flee from idolatry. Don't partake in those pagan practices that are going on in your city. Even though you came from that background, even though you partake of the Lord's Supper and show your union with Him, you can't do that and then partake of these pagan practices in your society, in your city. Can't do it. There's a principle there. I want you to think about something. I was preaching in Pensacola. There was a couple that after, I can't remember if it was after, I think it was, they moved away. After they moved away, I stayed in communication with them, and I learned at that point that the woman's father, I believe it was her father, was a denominational preacher. And it was not uncommon for them to be at the worship assembly and then leave right after the Lord's Supper. And on one occasion, they left after the Lord's Supper because and I forget what denominational group it was. I want to say it was a Pentecostal group, but they were having their 100th anniversary, this Pentecostal group was. So they were at our worship service in the Lord's church. They partook of the Lord's Supper, and they left our assembly to go to that assembly because it was the 100th anniversary of that church. You can't do that. You can't partake of the table of demons, and that's what I'll call it. Denominational practices, practices that originated with men. You cannot partake of the Lord's table and then go over here and worship with a group that does not belong to the Lord and everything be okay. Are you stronger than God? Are you trying to provoke Him to jealousy? You can't fellowship with denominationalism. It's not of God. It's kind of like Jesus says in Matthew 15:13, every plant which my Father has not planted shall be rooted up. There are some practices that sometimes members of the Lord's church get caught up in that violate this principle here in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Are you in communion with God, or are you going to commune with things that are not of God? You can't do it. You cannot do both of those things, and that's what he says there in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 21. So then he goes into this discussion again, and it goes back to conscience. But there's a law here that he's made. You cannot do these things. All things are permitted, lawful, the New King James says, for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but not all things edify. Now, all things are lawful. That doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. Obviously, that's within a certain scope. It's within the scope of God's will. Okay? There are things that you can do that God has not legislated, let's say, for or against. There are things that you can do that may be a matter of conscience that don't bother you, that may bother somebody else. Don't violate your conscience. We've already discussed that. Romans 14 discusses that. But also be mindful of the fact that not all things are helpful. They're not all beneficial. And not everything is for edification. It won't help everybody. And so here's what you have to do. Let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being. A Christian cannot unite himself in those pagan practices and be in fellowship with God. And then he gets back to the issue of conscience. There are some things you cannot do because you have to be mindful of others. And that's the point of verse 24. You don't seek your own. And so many people have that mindset. And I know we've talked about it a bit, but it's true. I'm going to do what I want to do, and it doesn't matter if it bothers anybody else, if it offends their conscience. Well, if you're doing God's will, that's one thing. You do it, and it really doesn't matter what other people think. But if it's a matter of conscience and you know it bothers somebody else, then you better be careful. You don't look out just for yourself. You got to look out for others as well. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market. He's going back to this issue now of food. Asking no questions. Don't ask where it came from. For conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Verse 26, what he's saying there, that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. That goes back to 1 Timothy 4. All these things are provided. Nothing is unclean of itself. The food that you eat is sanctified by prayer. Eat it, okay? But if there's an unbeliever who invites you to dinner, and I think this goes back to what he's talking about here in verses 14 through 22, the pagans, all right? They do things with a conscience toward the idol. So let's say one of those pagans, non-believers, verse 27, invites you to dinner, and you want to go. Perfectly fine. There's not a thing in the world wrong with that. Go. Eat what is set before you, notice this, and don't ask any questions. And you don't ask any questions for conscience sake. And it's going to go in both ways here, okay? You don't violate your own conscience, but now he's talking about someone else, a non-believer specifically. But if anyone says to you, so this non-believer, this non-Christian, this pagan, has invited you to dinner, they set meat before you, you be quiet and you just eat the food. However, if they say to you, verse 28, well, that was offered to idols. See, they're putting you to a test now as a Christian. They know that you're a Christian. They've invited you to dinner, and they are fully aware this was offered to an idol. Paul says, do not eat it for the sake of the one who told you, and for conscience sake. Because that person, this pagan, this non-believer, again, you go back up to verse, what verse was it? Let me look here. Okay, verse 20. The things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. That's the scenario that's being painted here. You don't eat it. If they come out and tell you, as a Christian, this was offered to idols, don't eat it for the sake of the one who told you, because they're putting you to the test, and for conscience sake, for the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. So now, that's the second time he's quoted that. The first time is, well, food is food, and food is neither right nor wrong. However, the circumstance in which you are eating that food can become wrong, and it has to do with conscience. And so you have to be mindful of that. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Now I have to be aware of myself and this other person's conscience. That's what he means there in verse 28. Conscience, I say, not your own, but that of the other. For why is my liberty judged by another man? See, I'm free. As a Christian, I'm free. I can eat meat. I can go to the meat market. I can buy food, and I can eat it, even if it's been offered to an idol, because I know an idol's nothing in the world. And what I eat doesn't condemn me, and what I don't eat does not condemn me. And that goes back into chapter 8. Chapter 8 and verse 8, in fact. But this non-believer's putting you to the test. Don't eat it. Don't violate your conscience. Don't violate his conscience. And so you don't eat it. Anyway, for why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? But if I partake with thanks, why am I evil spoken of for the food over which I give thanks? Well, because that person has put you in a situation where you have to be mindful. It's not a. It wasn't. Let's say it this way. It was not an innocent invitation to dinner. Here, sit down and have this food. And you pick up your fork and your knife, and they say, oh, by the way, that was offered to an idol. Then you leave it alone. You drop it. You don't eat it because of conscience sake. So then there are 3 principles that Paul gives us here. Actually, I think 4 principles. I think chapter 11, verse 1, in fact, I know it does. 11:1 really belongs as like chapter 10 and verse 34. So let's read it that way. But look at the principles here beginning in verse 31. Therefore, whether you eat or drink, here's principle number 1. Whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. All right, that's principle number 1. Principle number 2, give no offense either to the Jews or to the Gentiles or to the church of God. Okay, the way you conduct yourself, you have to be concerned with Christians and non-Christians alike in matters of conscience. Glorify God. Don't be intentionally offensive. You know, you can't help it sometimes but offend people. But this is the idea of your goal is to offend people. It's like, it's almost like it's, what's the word? Vindictive. Don't do that, okay? That's principle number 2. Principle number 3, just as I also please all men in all things, and he talked about that, remember, back in chapter 9, I become all things to all men, that by all means I might win some. All right? Just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. And so here's principle number 4. Follow me as I follow Christ. Imitate me as I imitate Christ. So, flee from idolatry. And he says, here's what it might look like. Here's a situation where you may find yourself, you're invited to dinner by a non-believer, eat whatever's set before you. That's perfectly fine. But if they bring up the situation of idolatry, don't eat it, because they're putting you to the test. And there are people like that. There are people who will try to put a stumbling block before you, and that's another thing, another principle. Don't intentionally, don't intend to cause people to stumble. That you don't want to do that. You don't want to be vindictive. You don't want to see how far can I push that person before they'll go off into sin. That's not a Christ-like attitude. And that's what he says there in chapter 11 and verse 1. Follow me as I follow Christ. Notice he doesn't just say follow me. He qualifies that as he followed Christ. So it's pretty interesting, the last half here of chapter 10, because it's, to me, chapters 8, 9, and 10, it's all a continuous flow. Really, the same principles are being taught throughout those 3 chapters. And it ultimately comes down to those principles that we find at the very end of chapter 10, 10:31 really through 11:1. So, a couple of comments here. Lyle says, I wonder about attending funerals at a denominational building. Well, a funeral's a funeral. It doesn't matter. We go to funerals in buildings that are owned by non-Christians. You know, a building's a building. Don't let that be an issue for you. I will say this, though. If it bothers your conscience, don't do it. That's one of the principles of the New Testament and conscience. If it bothers you, don't do it. But then at the same time, you can't go around and make a law for other people and say, that's a denominational building, you shouldn't go there. Building's a building. That doesn't matter. So, if it's a conscience issue to you, then it is to you. Jackie says this has a little to do with having compassion on those who might be weaker. Absolutely. At the same time, helping them to become stronger in the faith. No Christian needs to always be the weaker brother. So you have, back in 1 Corinthians 8, but also in Romans 14 and 15, you have this idea of the weaker and the stronger. There may be times when I am the weaker and you are the stronger, or you may be the weaker and I'm the stronger. The weak versus the strong has nothing to do with like how long have you been a Christian, how much of the Bible do you know, things like that. That's not weak and strong here in matters of conscience. The weak and the strong has to do with just that, the matter of the conscience. And I think 1 Corinthians 8 lays that principle out very well, that's what we're dealing with here. So I think we need to be careful with that too, because I can do something that doesn't violate my conscience and that's not a sin. That doesn't mean that somebody else who disagrees with me is a weak Christian. It's just that they have a weak conscience, a conscience that's easily offended in that particular situation, let's say. So, it's an interesting principle. The Old Testament, what is it? They say there were 613 laws, something like that. The New Testament has laws, and we are under law to Christ. I mean, Paul says that in 1 Corinthians 9:21. There's no question about that. And we are to fulfill the law of Christ, Galatians 6 and verse 2. But you can't go through the New Testament like you can the Old and find a bullet point of 613 laws that we're supposed to follow. There is liberty in Christ. Not liberty to sin, not liberty to do whatever we want to do, but there are matters of conscience. And I think that particular topic is one I know growing up, I didn't hear that. I never heard that. And maybe it's something that we need to hear more about, matters of conscience, matters of scruple, and not being ready to, okay, so here's an example. Not being ready to draw lines of fellowship because I know somebody who's a member of the church who went to a funeral at a denominational church building. You need to take it easy, slow down. Slow down a bit there, and don't make laws. That's just it. We cannot make laws where God has not made laws, but we cannot grant freedom where God has not granted freedom. And so there's some level of liberty there, and it should always be based on our knowledge of the new covenant of Christ, the new law. All right, guys. Appreciate you being on here today. Appreciate the interaction. Always do. And I want you to always feel free to ask questions or make a comment as we're going through these. So tomorrow, this should be interesting. We'll start in 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 2. And we'll go down through verse 16. That'll be the plan. We'll see how far we get, because this is a section dealing with a new topic, and it has to do with authority. So hopefully you can be back here tomorrow. Appreciate you being on here today. We'll be live here at Mammoth Spring tonight at 7 p.m. Central Time, and in the adult class in the auditorium, we're doing an overview of Luke's account of the life of Christ. All right, guys, have a good day, and hope to see you back here tomorrow at 11 o'clock.